the Center for Family Care. And we welcome you to this clergy couple webinar titled Marriage and Ministry in the Pandemic. It's about a year since this pandemic has totally disrupted our lives in every way imaginable, impacting our families, the communities we serve, and beyond. And the impact and the stress and the trauma has been multifaceted, either from a health perspective or even in conversations I've had with clergy, a financial level in which parishes have been impacted financially, extending the threat to clergy about whether their position is sustainable. So all of this really needs to be discussed. And we have the ideal person to help us and to walk us through to have this type of conversation and sharing and support. A little housekeeping before we begin. First, I want to express gratitude to Leadership 100 for underwriting this webinar and for the continual support in all aspects of our ministry. Second, we want to make this an interactive webinar. So at the bottom of your screen, you will note a Q&A box, and we encourage you throughout the presentation to forward your questions and your comments, and we'll try to share them and get to as many of the questions as possible during our time allotment. I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. George Stavros, a familiar face and name to all of us, and even that I think is very comforting to have someone that we all know well to be able to discuss this very difficult subject about stress and trauma. George is the executive director of the Danielson Institute and a clinical associate professor of pastoral psychology at Boston University. His teaching and research interests are in psychotherapy, psychotherapy training, and the close connection between spirituality and mental health. He is a licensed psychologist and a graduate of Holy Cross Greek Orthodox School of Theology. George, we welcome you, and we thank you that in your presentation, your outline is neatly categorized into three kind of segments. So what we'll do is, after each segment that you offer, perhaps we'll stop for a few questions, clarifications, we'll move to the next segment and continue on. Thanks so much again for your presence and wisdom and being with us today.
Thank you, Father Alex. As always, it's a pleasure and a privilege to be with you and to be with our clergy families, to be invited into this space to talk about some of the things that in some ways we're all facing, but that clergy families are facing in a particular way around stress and trauma. So in relation to that, let me just say the three main topics that we'll try to cover today are, first, the way in which relationship and relationships are central to an understanding of both the healthy development of human beings, physically, emotionally, spiritually, and how it's important to understand that centrality of relationship when we try to think about trauma and the impacts of trauma, and as well as the resilience in the face of trauma that we really want to promote. So relationships are central. The second thing that we'll touch on are some of the aspects or understandings of trauma from a physiological, psychological, and spiritual perspective. And the last thing that we'll talk about are some ways of maintaining health and resilience in the face of inevitable trauma, things that really are unavoidable, such as in the current conditions with the pandemic. I would say also the social situation in our country at this time can be traumatically experienced as well. So things that are pretty unavoidable, it's still possible to be healthy and resilient, and to find ways to deal with these things. So those three things, relationships, trauma, and resilience, will be our three segments for the day. And having done a few webinars with you, I usually say something like, oh, it's such a strange platform to know that there are so many people out there and that talking into a screen, it just doesn't feel comfortable and I'm not used to it. And it's about all I've done, as so many people, for like the last 10 months. So unfortunately, it feels quite familiar, but it's also easier for me to keep in mind that we are a group and a learning community right now. And that, that there are friends and colleagues out there right now who are part of this. So I just want to say welcome, and that I'm very happy to be a part of this right now. Okay, so let's start with relationships being central. A couple different perspectives on that. One perspective that some of you may have heard me talk about before is held within the developmental psychological frame of attachment theory. And I'm not going to do a long presentation of the specifics of attachment theory, but I do want to say just a couple things about it. One is it's a theory that's been developed very practically. It wasn't something that its original founders, John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, sat around thinking about and then tested out. It was something that they saw happening right in front of them. And that was the relationship between children and their caretakers. And the way that they noticed that some children seemed, for the most part, quite settled and secure in the way that they related to their caretakers, how they drew close to their caretakers when they were anxious, but then quickly separated from them and returned to a mode of learning and exploration once they felt settled down. And that was a secure way of relating. They also noticed other children in relation to their caretakers, some of whom seemed anxious the whole time that they observed them. They were anxious at the beginning of the observation, they were anxious in the middle, and they never really kicked into that exploration part of what they would understand to be possible for a securely attached child. So there were secure, there were anxious and preoccupied children who maintained close proximity at all times to their caretaker. And then there were other kids who didn't seem to be connected that intensely at all to their caretakers. As a matter of fact, they didn't make a lot of eye contact. They didn't have a lot of energy. They had more of what they termed an avoidant attachment relationship with their caretaker. So these different ways of relating between caretakers and children developed into a whole theory of understanding how human beings are literally wired at the deepest levels for relationship, to gain emotional regulation and steadiness, and to develop resilience and the capacity to learn and explore life based on the security that they feel with their caretaker. And security is understood in a particular way. A central part of that understanding has to do with what's called attunement. And caretaker attunement is when a child experiences different things over their development. From infancy forward, the emotions of experiencing newness are attuned to by their caretaker. So the experiences of an infant of their own needs of hunger or fatigue or discomfort, they don't think about how they respond to. Their whole system responds to these experiences. And caretakers who can attune to, in this case, an infant who is upset, and be attuned in an accurate way. In other words, to be able to discern between a stomach ache, hunger, a wet diaper, some other kind of pain, loneliness, in an accurate way, without the caretaker retaliating, becoming frustrated with the infant, or withdrawing giving up in the attempt to be attuned. That's like the magic mix of relating that has to take place for us over a lifetime. And over a lifetime, as we become older children and adolescents and adults, we get better at being able to tune into ourselves as well. But we also need other people who get us. It's like the special sauce of human development. And what results from that kind of attunement is a combination of felt security as well as a capacity for learning and exploration. Attachment theorists say these are the two core functions, if you will, the two core expressions of being human: to relate securely and intensely, and to explore and learn, to grow in one's capacity to explore and learn. I mean, there are tremendous connections, I think, to our understanding of a spiritual development or a spiritual life in this way of thinking about what humans are all about. If it was all just about intense, secure relating, it would be closed. It would be a closed system. Once people got their needs for secure relating met, there would be no need to explore or learn. If it was just about exploring or learning, the kind of vital recharging of the soul and the spirit through relationship wouldn't be present. So it's these two things working in tandem. From an attachment theory perspective, they're key: secure, intense relating and exploration.
George, can I just interrupt for a second? Your point about that we're wired for relationship, I'm sure we can all relate to that, and that our faith would say something very similar to that, that we're wired for relationship. Your connection, though, with attachment theory and anxiety, would it be okay to say that anxiety is on a spectrum? Because surely we all experience anxiety, normal anxiety, stress and anxiety and so forth. So it's not the elimination of anxiety completely. So would it be okay to say that anxiety is on a spectrum in terms of how we experience it and how we relate to others with our anxiety?
Yes, that's a great question. And one of the most important things that the attachment theorists discovered and lifted up is that secure attachment is not in place to eliminate emotional dysregulation or anxiety or depression or sadness or any emotion. Secure relating creates the, if you will, the safe haven to which one can return in the face of experiences that leave us emotionally dysregulated. Inevitably leave us emotionally dysregulated and anxious. Anxiety is a normal part of the human makeup. Its experience and its effects are located in a deeper part of the brain than the part that we often think of as the brain, the decision making, the problem solving, the creativity that we associate with thinking. There are essentially three levels of the brain, and anxiety lives deeper than that level. It's almost like we can't think ourselves into and out of being anxious. We need more than that. We need relationship to help us when we're anxious. And part of the reason for that is anxiety is a part of the human endowment that sends messages to us about the realities that we face. Sometimes we have to be scared. Sometimes we have to be anxious. Sometimes we need emotional discomfort and dysregulation to let us know what we're up against. The problem with that is that alarm system oftentimes only has one frequency. And once it gets tripped, we need the thinking part of our brain combined with our relationships to interpret the alarm signal that's been tripped, the anxiety. And that's how we reduce the intensity and the frequency of it. is through relationship and through experience and thinking, through the higher parts of our brain. But that we have an alarm system, that's anxiety, is inevitable. It's just, it's part of the system that gets affected the most by trauma. Which, why don't we pause here? I'm glad you brought in the theological aspect of relationality and our Trinitarian understanding of God's relationality at the core of all uncreated and created reality. It resonates that human beings created in the image and likeness of a relational God must be relational themselves. What's pretty cool from the perspective of a combined mental health spirituality perspective is that it resonates across both ways of thinking about human beings. But we could take a breath here, because I think anxiety and thinking about anxiety goes right into our discussion of trauma really nicely. So
Before we move into that, George, can you say a few words about what happens when we did not have the opportunity to secure healthy attachments, perhaps in our families of origin? Are there ways to overcome that in our development so that we're not left to the result of perhaps a poor parenting or poor childhood and poor attachment, that we can still somehow, through God's grace and through other resources, be able to establish these healthy attachments?
sure. So I'm gonna offer two what might seem to be simultaneously competing truths. Two things that are true at the same time, but in some ways seem like they contradict. But it's absolutely vital to think of them both as coexisting. One is that early traumatic experience, early experiences of abuse, neglect, abandonment, and trauma can leave the developing child, who then moves into adulthood, with pre-existing vulnerabilities for having a very hard time regulating emotions and anxiety. So the lost opportunity in early development for developing the internal mechanisms that go along with secure relating do have implications later in life. It becomes harder to contain and de-intensify the experience of internal emotional suffering when those regular rhythmic caretaker interactions weren't in place. And to the extent that those caretaker interactions were characterized by grief, intense grief, loss, or abuse, even more so, the world just feels literally like a more dangerous place for people who've been through those kinds of experiences. That's true. What is also true is what's being discovered more and more in cognitive neuroscience all the time, and that is that this amazing organ of our brain has the capacity for what neuroscientists call neuroplasticity. So to the extent that someone comes into different parts of their life having experienced early trauma and have a disrupted internal system that interprets the world in a very dangerous way, that either has to be defended against or avoided, or safety has to be sought all the time. Subsequent experiences and relationships can develop new plastic, it means flexible, new flexible ways of experiencing the world through relational experiences. So still, these things are mediated through relationship that help to expand or explore different ways of understanding, experiencing, and interpreting the world that are not characterized only by their risk or their danger or their inevitable loss that will be associated with them. So yes, people can have, based on difficult early development, vulnerabilities for seeing the world in a dangerous way and having the internal experience of that be difficult. And yes, that can be healed. And it's oftentimes, it's a slower process than the hurt oftentimes, because our alarm systems for danger have to be very efficient and get us aware of danger so that we can respond to it quickly. And the cool off period is much slower. And oftentimes it has, well, all the time, it has to have a secure relational component to it, but it also has to have predictability and rhythm and experiences of beauty and joy over a slower, longer period. But the brain is so amazing and resilient that it has this neuroplasticity ability to cool off and to in the cooling off to develop other pathways towards a more regulated and expanded life.
Two more just quick observations, and then we can move into the trauma section because that's the focus. One is you use the term attuned to others and ourselves. And I was thinking of the way that how Jesus related to every strata of society, and he had the ability to be able to make connections, whether they were with tax collectors and prostitutes and poor fishermen and farmers, or members of the Sanhedrin and those who were of a wealthy and academic background. And obviously, Christ is our model for everything. And I think that sense of attunement, I think is something that we can aspire to and see how it is applied in the gospel. The other thing, just real quickly, had to do with relationship and how Trinity, we use familial language of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit in terms of relating that we're children of God. We don't understand God as some distant, unknowable force. And I think just the language that we use in our faith so much centers on this sense of relationship. But if you could move into the trauma section, George, and then we'll go from there.
Sure. Okay, so we've taken a couple preliminary steps into understanding trauma. Trauma, when we talk about trauma, we're essentially talking about events, either singular events or regularly or sporadically occurring events that are experienced by human beings as life-threatening. And life-threatening has a broad definition in that it's not just physical life that has to be threatened, but the lives of loved ones that could be threatened, the integrity of one's physical or emotional or spiritual self. So one might not be afraid that their life is going to end in the face of a trauma, but there could be the fear that one's identity could be changed forever, or one could lose one's connection to loved ones on a permanent basis. That's why things like illness of loved ones can be a powerful trauma. That's why things like relational events like divorces, severe relational ruptures can be experienced as traumatic, because they're getting at the very integrity of a person's identity and the threat that that's going to come apart or be annihilated somehow or be erased. So anything that human beings experience in that world can be experienced as traumatic. In this way, we say that trauma disrupts the relational systems that we need to interpret the world in a way that allows us to be both secure and to explore. Trauma is something that disrupts that security in such a way that we're stuck with one interpretation about the world, and it is that we are threatened, we are in danger. There is something we have to do to protect ourselves. And so the capacity to the capacity to learn and explore collapses. And what happens is human beings have to go into a mode that has one of four components. Actually, it could have several of these, but there are four typical ways that a person responds to trauma. Some of these are going to be very familiar. There's a fight response. We're going to have to take on the thing that is threatening us. There's a flight response. We're going to have to get away from that threat as quickly as possible. There's a freeze response. You can see this in some animals where they encounter a threat and they literally freeze. Human beings do the same thing, physically, emotionally, spiritually. It's as if our capacity to go beyond ourselves collapses and we run out of options about what to do. So fight, flight, freeze. And one that's being explored more and more in trauma research is, it's called different things, but because it rhymes with freeze and it's easy to remember, is appease. So fight, I have to fight the threat. Flight, I have to run from the threat. Freeze, I have no options but to shut down in face of the threat. Or appease is now understood as a trauma response. I have to figure out how to accommodate that threat so that it will not overwhelm me. And this is more common in relational trauma situations where there might be a perpetrator or an abuser and a victim who has to figure out ways that may not be and probably are not in their best interests long term in order to survive the encounter with the perpetrator or the abuser. Fight, flight, freeze, appease. So in relation to these four ways of responding, we mentioned this before, the activation of those four things tends to be very quick. The alarm system goes off, we're threatened, we go into one of those modes, and then if some sort of baseline safety can be established, the cooling off period is much, much longer in order to get to a place where there is more flexibility of response again. And a lot of this has to do with, how does one see the world? Well, how does one see the world in a fight response? The world is an opponent or an enemy. How is the world interpreted in a flight response? The world is a pursuing threat. Freeze, appease, you can kind of fill in the blanks on these things. What the trauma researchers are coming to understand is that the limitations that people who live in either acutely or chronically traumatized states face, the dilemma that they face, is competing input about a safe world, or a world that has a place for them, or a world in which they can function and not be afraid, don't exist as long as they are in the heightened state of trauma. And that's what makes recovery from trauma so difficult. It also, which we'll talk about in the third segment, is what makes the work around resilience and recovery and inoculation against trauma so fascinating. And I think the participants in this webinar probably have more ideas about that than I do. But we'll get to that later about the resilience and the response.
George, how about this? Can we glean from your comments the distinction between acute and chronic stress and trauma? Because perhaps our listeners have experienced both of the course of the year. There may be chronic trauma after having to deal with this for a year. And then there may be those moments of acute that maybe somebody in their family has experienced COVID or some other very, very troubling event. Is there a distinction to be made in terms of our responses and how we adapt to whether it's acute or whether it's chronic?
Yes. So Let me share something in response to your question really quickly on the screen that has to do with understanding chronic trauma related to COVID. What I'm going to share is a graph that's been developed through a lot of research on disasters and their impact on human functioning. And it's looked at things like earthquakes, tsunamis. I know the Haiti earthquake data is in here. This is a look at the ways in which communities respond. Now, this isn't to say everybody responds this way, but from a public health perspective, this is like a picture of the journey that communities take in response to major disasters or traumas. Okay, so as you can see, this lays out a period before the actual trauma occurs. So there may be some warning that it's going to happen. Obviously, with earthquakes and tsunamis, this period is not a 6-month period. And the pre-disaster period isn't necessarily as important. But with something like COVID, it's actually quite relevant, because we were hearing for months beforehand what was happening in other parts of the world and wondering whether or not it was going to get to the United States, and wondering whether the warnings and the threats about its possible impact here were accurate or not. So as you can see, if we're starting from a baseline here, there's some emotional reactions, some building stress and its impact on how people are doing to the point of impact, if you will. So let's say that sometime in March, when shutdowns start to happen and it's clear that things are going to have to change. I can only imagine the stories we would hear from the participants today of what they've had to do in their parishes, what they've had to do with their kids' school, what they've had to do with their finances, what they've had to do with their communications, family relationships, parents, any number of things. But the typical response in the community to that burst of traumatic experience is there's this heroic, it's called a heroic surge to do everything we possibly can to confront. It's as if our collective fight and flight, in this sense, it's like our collective fight response gets activated. And there's activation is actually a good word. This heroic sense of we've got to do something. I remember feeling in the first weeks, and actually maybe the first couple months after COVID hit, we had to flip everything we were doing here at the Danielson Institute clinically and training wise to a remote platform. And I know that's a familiar story. In some ways it was energizing. It was exhausting, but it was energizing. We did something we never thought we would have to do or never thought we could do. And yet we did it. And there was a kind of energized feeling to that. Everybody was fighting the good fight. We were in it together, and it crescendoed with this honeymoon community cohesion sense. Not that that was one event, but we did have the sense that we were doing something important together. And we had faced head on that some of these challenges. Well, if only the story ended there, we would have been in a better place than when the impact happened. But as happens so often in these large scale disasters, there is an inexorable decline in well-being after that honeymoon phase is over. And I would say we have now moved into this territory here, the period of disillusionment, which is this ever going to end? We have things happen like, oh my God, there's a new strain that's even more difficult to stop from spreading. Or, we had we're having all kinds of social unrest as all this is happening. So it's doubling down on the stress. And so we're living with some sense of this disillusionment now, with little glimpses, I think, through the hopes of vaccine and time passing and get, people starting to, take things seriously enough that the spread is starting to slow down. the hope here is that we're going to start as a community, our well-being is going to start to go up again. Inevitably, there will be things like anniversary reactions that bring the community back into a place of trauma. But the work that's coming, and you asked about in terms of chronic stress, what is the work? A lot of the work is working through grief. I don't think we've started that work to any great extent yet. And we're talking about large-scale communal grief. There's been plenty of grief people have experienced in relation to individual circumstances. But from a community perspective, there's going to be a working through grief, a coming to terms with what has happened, with the number of illnesses, the number of deaths, the number of changes, the number of losses. And that is what's going to help us reconstruct a new beginning. So it's paradoxical in a way. How are we going to get to a place where we're functioning strongly and our well-being goes back up? It's going to be through working through grief, which is, that may have theological implications.
George, a question from one of our listeners looking for a clarification. Did you say that after trauma, the cooling off period happens longer when the security relational base happens fast? It seems like that would be the opposite, where the cooling off period happens slower if people are unable to connect with safe relationships quickly.
Good question. So the thing that happens fast is that the dysregulated response, the activation of the trauma system in us. So we go into fight, flight, freeze, or appease very fast. The cooling off period is slower than the activation period. Let me just be clear about that. So activation, the trauma occurs, the shock is very fast, we have to mobilize fast. The cooling off, very slow. But the cooling off period for people who are coming from a more secure relational base tends to be faster. It's going to be slower than the activation, but it will be faster than those for whom the trauma is a trauma layered on a trauma. Those who may have a more insecure attachment style. That cooling off period is going to be longer. Now, both of these cooling off periods have to take place in the context of secure relating. So the cool off is a relational cool off. Mm-hmm. But if the person cooling off has some basic baseline trust in the world, in themselves, and others, their cooling off period will be shorter than someone whose baseline experience is of mistrust, either in themselves, in others, in the world.
Mm-hmm. Another interesting question that we may need to delay until you've completed your section on resilience. It had to do with, and I'm adapting here, how we minister to our children who are experiencing these traumas and helping them with resilience. But perhaps we should speak first about resilience for ourselves and what that entails, because I think we all want to walk away from this webinar with perhaps some tools or suggestions about how to instill some level of resilience in this ongoing battle that we're facing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'm going to give hopefully at least 3 examples of what we can do in relation to resilience. Some more general, some more specific. First one, just to have a word to go back to when we're scrambling and we're more overwhelmed and dysregulated by trauma. Connect, 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 connect. Connect with ourselves, because trauma, the impacts of trauma, both acute and chronic, is by nature to disconnect us from ourselves, to keep us from thinking too much, to keep us from having multiple screens open. It's to focus us on trauma. It's to literally disconnect at a neurocognitive neural level disconnect a part of ourselves so that we can survive. So if we're in that mode, connect, 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 connect to ourselves, even if it's just to say, I'm disconnected right now. I'm in a trauma response. But other things that we found from some of our COVID-related research here at the Danielson with our patients, asking them how they're finding some resilience and also the impacts of trauma on them. Interesting is connecting with at least one person a day, depending on your circumstances, for no other reason than to just spend a few minutes together. So purpose related connection. It's almost like before we started the webinar today, Father Alex and Maria Deveris and I took 2 minutes to just be together quietly and to share in some scripture. It was so incredibly grounding from an emotional perspective and a relational perspective, and it was great preparation for us to do this. But it had no specific purpose other than to give us a chance to be together. Connect with nature. We've heard from so many of our clients that getting outside and having the sensations of being outdoors in some way connected them with something larger than themselves. So connecting with others, connecting with nature, and then in whatever way, and we'll talk about this actually down the road in just a minute, finding ways to connect with God, to connect with the most sacred parts of life, the most sacred relationship that we have. Connect, connect, connect is number one in response to trauma.
So just, George, just on that point, when we hear connect, we live in a digital age and we think of connecting through social media and so forth. And we've seen during this past year how actually destructive that can be and how painful that can be. So I'm assuming from your comments, we're talking about substantive connections in life-giving people, circumstances, nature, and so forth. That would be that level of connection that you're referring to, correct?
Yes, and I think here it's so important. It's so important to try to discern, because what I don't want to do is completely demonize the ways in which the electronic world now give us opportunities for some genuine connection. We're reliant on them right now. But the discernment process is there's also trillions of dollars going towards the ways in which electronic connections can capture us in the activated state and actually keep us there, keep us dysregulated, keep us ungrounded, and keep us seeking not a slow relational cool off, but offering the myth of a quick cool off that's just as fast as the activation. And these can be, any number of things that either pull money out of our pockets or change our consciousness through substances or through pornography, gambling, extreme binge watching television, video games. I'm not saying throwing all video contact out. What I'm saying is it's tricky and requires a lot of discernment, because there are anti-relational forces baked into the electronic world that we have to be aware of. Anything that offers a quick cool off, I would say you got to be very careful of. Anything that disconnects us.
Very helpful. Yeah. Good. So connect is one. What would be some of the other points of resilience that would be helpful for us?
All right. So this next one comes from some of our Danielson research. And a lot of this is on work that we've done with religious leaders and religious leaders' families. We've coined it cultivating humility practices. Now I realize we're using a social science definition of humility, so I would ask that people really integrate this in to the extent that it connects with an Orthodox Christian understanding of humility. But the way we are defining humility from a social science perspective is humility includes the capacity to have a realistic view of oneself, neither overestimating oneself or underestimating oneself, but pretty accurate. The capacity to be open-hearted, to have an ecstatic heart, a heart that reaches out in a hospitable way into the world. The capacity to modulate emotions, particularly of humiliation, shame, pride. And these are especially important because what we found is that shame and humiliation as emotions tend to be accelerants on existing negative emotions. If I feel down, if I feel depressed and I feel humiliated or shamed, it deepens it exponentially. If I'm anxious and I'm ashamed, I become that much more anxious. And so these feelings of shame and humiliation and pride and containing them, and we'll say something about how to contain them in the next section, hugely important, but also part of cultivating humility. Not being preoccupied with social status would be another example. The capacity to identify with people less fortunate than us, people who are oppressed or marginalized, another example of humility. So cultivating these practices.
So could we also add that in these humility practices, that it might be even more effective in sharing these with people that we trust? In other words, to mirror others, what their thoughts are of us. So maybe we don't see things very clearly. And maybe as a way of sharing what we're experiencing, might be even a more effective way of practicing these humility practices, so that left to my own devices, I may convince myself of anything, but if I'm in a safe environment with a person or people that I trust, then that feedback will be even more accurate, we might say. Would that be true?
Oh, it's absolutely true. Humility is a completely and thoroughly relational.
Vulnerability, then.
Yeah,
We might add humility with vulnerability.
exactly. There's no humility without vulnerability. It's true. And having people of the heart, trusted others, to be, in a sense, part of our cultivation of humility is indispensable. Knowing ourselves, we all come into adult life with a history, with a developmental history, with the injuries and the victories that we've experienced over that time. And part of being accountable for how we impact the world is taking account of that and taking that seriously and knowing where we've come from, and that it means we look at the world in a certain way and trying to be flexible about that. And we can't do that without other people. Nobody can be humble alone.
Good. What else is on your list for this section?
Okay, so I want to answer the question about children. Let me put this one out there, and then we'll talk about the kids. So the third thing I have here is a colleague of ours here at the Danielson. He actually is a longtime professor out at Bowling Green University, and he's kind of the grandfather of the combined perspectives on mental health and spirituality. His name's Ken Pargament. And what Ken has discovered in his research is that there's this thing that he's encountering that he describes as sacred moments. And he's discovered these through conversations with research subjects and therapy clients. And essentially, the way he's defining a sacred moment is it's a moment, could be big or dramatic, anywhere on that spectrum, that leaves the experiencer with the sense that life and love are much bigger and more pervasive than they let themselves or are able to know in the moment. So a sacred moment is when, in some small or great way, it's as if the world cracks open and we see that there is more life and love and access to God's love, sacred love, than we experience in the rhythms of daily life. And what Ken has found is the people who experience these things and describe them have a higher sense of well-being, tend to get less depressed or depressed for less long, tend to be less anxious or not anxious for as long. And I think the big one that in relation to our conversation here is it's almost like they are inoculated against the worst effects of stress and trauma. It's not that they don't get affected, but it's like a vaccine. It keeps the worst of it at bay. So, these could be any number of things. Let me just share a quick example that I experienced recently. One of my daughters was going to read at the service for Gregory the Theologian. I go to St. Gregory the Theologian Parish, and we were having the Vespers last night. 7 o'clock on Sunday night. Believe me, at around 6:15, I was saying, what craziness is this? Who in the world would schedule? Sorry, Father Alex. My Father Alex at St. Gregory. Who in the world would schedule a Vespers at 7 p.m. on a Sunday night when it's 15 degrees outside? But my daughter had to read. So we went. There are like 15 people there. We sang Fos Hilaron, and I swear, I thought I was starting to levitate because I hadn't heard that chanted in so long. And because it was chanted in a way that reminded me of things like being in the chapel or being at camp. And it was like the world dissolved for a minute and 20 seconds. And the love that's available was just, it was so obvious and clear to me in that moment. Sacred moment. It had an impact. Another example, a client of mine has a son and a daughter. They get in each other's stew a lot. They're both teenagers. There are times where it just isn't going well. They've spent more time together because of COVID. One of them was listening to a song. Instead of fighting, somehow both kids started singing the song because they both liked it. And the mother said she stopped. She stopped and just listened to her two children singing, their voices together, blending perfectly together. And she said it became so much more than listening to her two children sing. It became that opening of God's grace, love, presence, availability. She said it changed her whole night, and she can't stop thinking about it.
So George, these are very practical and effective suggestions in terms of resilience. Because of the intensity of the pandemic, there must be a place where maybe professional help might be a suggestion. Can you give some direction in terms of when it's appropriate? What would be some signs for us to consider professional help as well?
Yes, absolutely. So let me offer 3 signposts. One is, to the extent that each of us knows ourselves well enough, if we're saying to ourselves, this is gone, this bad feeling in me, this upsetness in me has gone on longer than I've experienced it going on before. This feels different. That would be one sign, is our self-knowledge that's something is going on that's more intense than it's been in the past. Now, this probably isn't a surprise, but many of us can blow right through that signpost. So it's not the only one. As a matter of fact, it's pretty common to just blow through that and try to keep on keeping on. So number 2 would be the typical strategies that we have to contain our suffering don't work as well anymore. Oh, exercise, usually that clears my head and I'm good. It's not working so good. Eating a good, healthy meal and, just preparing it, that usually helps and that clears my head. No, that's not working anymore. So if it's going on for longer than usual and the things that we typically do to help ourselves aren't working, that'd be signpost 2. Believe me, we can blow through both of those quite easily as well. So number 3 is when you start hearing from the people who know and love you the most, something's not right. There's more going on here. Please, you got to do something. 3 signposts. Check in with ourselves. Typical strategy's not working. So our loved ones, the people of our heart are saying something's up.
Those are very good thoughts. Couple questions from our listeners that I want to make sure we get to. This first one has to say, please name some of the specific traumas we are experiencing right now, particularly as members of a clergy family.
Okay, so clergy families are not only experiencing the larger trauma of COVID, clergy and clergy families are conduits for the suffering of their communities. In some ways, it's one of their roles is to be containers for what's going on in the larger community. So that can result in a kind of secondary trauma, an accumulation of other people's traumas, their sadness, their losses, the deaths that happen, the illnesses that happen, tend to funnel through the clergy and their families. So not only is it dealing with what's going on in our own lives and our own families' lives, it's being this conduit within the community is a huge risk factor, if you will, for clergy. I would say that the combined high expectations that clergy come up with some way that's brilliant to connect in the time of COVID and remote church and remote pastoring, together, those expectations, together with the impossibility of meeting those demands or reaching those heights or figuring out anything other than to just try to hold things together. The difference between those things, which I think is always in place between the expectations for clergy and their families and what's actually possible, has this new wrinkle to it that I think can be very corrosive and disheartening.
And George, if we can return to the question posed regarding what we can do to help our children to, in the moments that we're dealing with in the pandemic, ways to encourage their level of resilience. Just in general, if you can offer a few thoughts on the family.
Sure. Keep ourselves as parents plugged into ways that we can stay resilient. Find every way possible, the sacred moments, the humility practices, the connect. Make that part of our rhythm, and then take pieces of that and talk about it with our kids in ways that are developmentally appropriate. 2, work in small but regular structured ways of connecting that may be atypical to how you usually are with the kids, but that you lock onto. Things like playing a game together, developmentally appropriate, picking a movie or a show night or a couple nights that you wouldn't typically do, including them in cooking a meal and giving them some fun responsibility in the midst of that. It gives them connect with you. It also gives them something to do, some other ways to not just be relationally secure or traumatized, but also to continue what they have to do developmentally, and that's learn and explore. 3rd thing is, to the extent that it makes sense to you and you can find ways to do it that are creative, get them out of their COVID routines, and whether it's put them around a fire pit with safe others, even if it's just you, go for walks into nature, pull out a basketball or a volleyball, pull out a musical instrument, mix things up, but mix them up in a way that's regular and that allows them, again, to be in that explore mode and not just seeking security. And, I'm saying this as one of 2 parents that's dealing with this all the time. The whole screen time thing has gone through the roof both for practical reasons and because there just isn't as much going on. Don't get, don't get too crazy about that, but offset it if you can. Set some structured time for it, then offset it with some of these other somatic, creative energies that you can put into play. They'll respond. They may resist, but you'll be able to find something.
What a blessing it's been to be speaking with Dr. George Stavros, familiar face, familiar friend. George has the ability to integrate the teachings of our faith and traditions together with the advances of psychology to help present us with resources to help support ourselves, our families, and our ministries. A reminder that this webinar will be archived and will be available on the Clergy Couple Care website by the end of this week. George, thank you so much again for your availability and all of your support of our ministry.
Thank you for the invitation, Father Alex. It really is a privilege and a pleasure.